All right, my friends, we're going to be going over the new StarCraft 2 patch. It's a pretty big patch, so that's always interesting. That's always going to stir up the pot, and I think that that's mostly a good thing, but we'll go over that too. So yeah, let's see. Patch notes. We've tried to make the PTR focus on extending the early game and mid-game experience, allowing for players to retain competitive on 1 to 3 bases for longer periods. We've introduced changes to make non-warp gate play more viable path, while also increasing the overall strategic diversity across all 3 races. In addition, a range of quality of life improvements have been implemented to enhance the overall player experience. Okay, so we're gonna separate a couple of things here first. Just like we did in the previous video, I think it's important to note, and I personally like to differentiate design, which has to do with how the game feels cohesive, how the game has an identity, how different races have identities. It has to do with, oftentimes, with fantasy. It has to do with including that sort of intangible that is not completely straight up related to just balance, effectively, right? And basically how the game plays out in a vacuum. Because we're not playing, you know, a game of squares and circles. We're playing a game that has an identity and races that are meant to be asymmetric, etc. So again, we'll be making distinctions between design and balance stuff as we go, because this patch is a heavy mix of both. So economy. Starting workers reduced from 12 to 8. This is the one that everyone's going to be talking about. I would say that it is one of the bigger changes on paper. I think the idea is basically to introduce more gameplay variance in the early game, right? Like, the lower the worker count on paper, what it does is it makes it so that there is a wider variety of things that you can opt into earlier as you curve into base being saturated, right? So we used to have 6 worker starts way back in the day. Now we've gone to 8. At some point we increased it to 12. The 12 worker increase was effectively made so that you would cut out the part of the game that felt stale and felt a little bit too static, right? In favor of, okay, we're a more mature audience, an audience that has stuck through with the game, and a lot of this hassle, a lot of the tediousness of producing workers to a certain point actually you know, is undesirable, was the idea back then. Now we're thinking we gotta mix things up, and from the perspective of mixing things up with what we can presume, I think, is a pretty small team at Blizzard, if you know, if it's a team. I think it's one of the bigger changes for the least amount of effort that you can put in, right? It's one of the easiest things to change. You just go and change that starting parameter, and then the game substantially changes. So there's a lot of permutations that come out of that. I'm unsure about this. I don't lean one way or the other. For the sake of change, I think it's okay. From this, as a game developer, what I would want to think about is, who is my audience at this point, right? StarCraft 2 is a game that's over 15 years old now. A lot of the audience is, to a good degree, change averse. A lot of the audience is mature and older audience. That means less leisure time, less learning time, and less propensity to want for big changes that don't really have a wider impact. In the sense that, for example, if you introduce a new unit that's a new toy to play with, for a lot of people this will feel like, I have to relearn all of the stuff that I have been learning for the last many years. So that's a massive turnoff for a lot of people. What this does do is, it, like the counterbalance to that, right, is it creates an environment where people are going to be actively talking about it, as I am right now, where players and content creators, say like Hearthstone or Lambo or, you know, or Loco or Winter will have, or Pig will have the opportunity to jump in, and Euthermal in particular perhaps will have the opportunity to jump in, create new content, make new strategies, and how loud that is can have a positive impact on the player base as a whole as well, right? So there's a counterbalance there. There's the balance of who is my audience, how old is my audience, how long have they been playing for, how receptive to change are they, because there are definitely different games that kind of like set different expectations for the amount of change. And then there is the how much are people going to be talking about this, how much content is going to be produced, etc. And you know, somewhere in between you get either a plus or a minus in terms of player base. My assumption is we're going to get a big spike, or a decent spike perhaps, as soon as the patch drops. People are going to try it out. Players that are actively playing, whether they like it or not, they're probably going to give it a try. Players who were actively playing before will come back to try it out. And then after that spike, it'll go down for sure. Absolutely. It'll go down because there's no marketing efforts. There's no active new content, new skins, new races, none of that, right? Like there's no investment into StarCraft 2. Let's just be clear and honest about that. So there is not an expectation for a consistent rise. There is not much, right? There's just the content creators and how much they can do to keep the game afloat. So overall, my inclination is this is probably gonna end up dwindling the population as a whole, but it'll be fun. And if you can create the expectation that this is gonna happen regularly, say every 3 months, every 6 months, then those spikes can actually start to carry over. Those spikes can actually start to mount up to where you know the downslope that follows is not as steep, or at least can remain somewhat stable. So yes, this will introduce new build orders. There will be 8 pools and 9 pools and 10 pools, right, and what have you, and it is interesting from that perspective. It also introduces variance in the way that scouting becomes more expensive, right? Because scouting is effectively when you take a probe or an SCV out of your mineral line to scout, it is a percentage of your total economy. Now this change begs for, you know, cheese gets stronger. Basically, early game builds get stronger because there's more that can happen, but you have to balance that against the cost of scouting, which is steeper now because it's a greater percentage of your economy that you're, you know, forfeiting when you go across the map with an SCV, right? So I hope that's clear. If you have, you know, 8 workers and you take one out, that's a greater percentage than if you have 12 workers and you take one out. Okay, so I would label this change neutral. Not sure how it's going to play out. We could give the benefit of the doubt there. Now, default large mineral patch resource count reduced from 1800 to 1600. Default small mineral patch count increased from 900 to 1200. Default minerals per base increased from 10,000 to 11,200. And default Bespin geysers reduced count increased, resource count increased from 2250 to 2500. So total default gas per base increased from 4,500 to 5,000. So overall, I really dislike these changes. I think the idea from having watched other videos and people commenting on those videos and kind of like a little bit of what the developers are trying to say here, the idea is to basically have access, the players now have access to more aggressive openings, to more cheese, to more variety in the early game. And one of the destabilizers, or one of the things that would basically discourage people from doing that, is the fact that your base, you know, one base you run out of the 4 patches a little bit sooner, so it's harder to sustain, and this is meant to give some sort of opening into stabilizing. I believe that is an illusion by large. I think that that's not a good reason to do that, to do this, because ultimately what happens, and I think that anyone that has played the game and knows how snowbally RTS math in general can be, knows that if you are significantly ahead or behind, or even a little bit ahead or behind, especially in the early game, those advantages carry over throughout the game pretty hard. So you would have to outplay your opponent pretty hard to actually come back from a significant deficit. So basically, yes, you will be able to stay on one base for longer after a failed attack or all-in, That much is true, but you're probably dead anyway unless you did enough damage, which was already a constraint that existed prior. I hope that makes sense. So effectively, if you're behind, you're behind. You may delay your death, but I think that that period of I killed you, but now I have to kill you. Now, you know, I beat you, but now I have to kill you, effectively, is an undesirable amount of time where closing out the game becomes a little bit of a chore, a little bit of a, you know, a methodology that you have to employ to make sure that you don't mess up, and just kind of waste time in the process. It's just dead time, right? Like yeah, in basketball games, right? Sometimes the game isn't over. Like there's enough time on the clock, but there's not enough time that the other team can make a comeback because there's not enough time to score enough baskets or whatever have you, right? So it's a similar situation to that, where you might be dead, but you may not be out of the game yet, and this doesn't solve for that. So what it does do in the on the negative front, because we've described, I think, hopefully somewhat accurately what the intent is with this change, what it does do on the negative front of things is that it actually makes it so that you can turtle for longer, right? So this is a pretty fucking bad change, because turtling is the antithesis of fun, and it is one of the problems that StarCraft already suffers from, right? No one likes to watch or play games where, you know, you just make a bunch of cannons and go into tempests in 2 or 3 bases. And now that sort of style is actually buffed by these changes, right? It is also obviously a ninja nerf to Zerg, but again, on the balance front, I think we don't have to worry too much about that. But I will just note that it is a ninja balance nerf to Zerg, right? Because the increase overall in resources, the fact that you can turtle on 3 bases, that is more of a Protoss or Terran maneuver. Zerg excels at expanding, right? Like our hatcheries are cheaper, and we have creep, we have mobile queens as on the side of the Zerg, which means that our defense is a little bit more flexible. Zerg is effectively a defensive race that can expand quickly. Terran and Protoss have to invest more resources into expanding, such as making walls, setting up pylons, batteries, cannons, etc. So a Protoss expansion is not just more expensive than a Zerg expansion in terms of like the resources that you pay for the Nexus versus the hatchery, but also the setup costs around the expansion to actually have it be functional and not get completely ravaged by you know, like more mobile armies or harassment, which Zerg excels at, right? So basically this says to me, okay, turtle play, which is a cancer and it's terrible, is buffed. That's really, from a design perspective, what they're doing, and the trade-off that they are imagining is not real. So hate this change. 1 out of 10. Worker start, whatever, 5 out of 10. I'll stay neutral. I can be persuaded that it's for the better, but this is dreadful. I proposed, or I would propose an idea, for example, alternative to this, that would actually accomplish the goals that they're setting up to go for. That is, if you want more early game aggression and you don't want turtle as a result, right? What you could actually do to make that more viable would be to effectively remove 1 or 2 mineral patches from each expansion. So kind of going in the opposite direction. You could even keep the expansions or the bases at the same total mineral count. But if you remove a couple of patches from the expansion, that changes the math on optimal saturation effectively, right? So for example, if I just have six mineral patches, instead of 8, right? That means that I can saturate with 4 less workers at 12 instead of going up to 16. That means that if I don't want to opt into an expansion, I can actually stay optimally saturated on one base and be on pretty similar grounds to an opponent that needs to expand if they don't want to match my aggressive cadence, right? So then the expansion for the opponent becomes a greater liability because they have to drop it earlier, and all of the early game builds that would emerge from this changes to the worker count would actually be significantly more viable, more powerful, and have a little bit more punch behind them. So I think that would be, for example, an interesting change. And then down the line, what would happen is you're actually making expanding more necessary. Expansions in StarCraft 2 are where the action happens, because again, most Terran and Protoss need to basically make their bases more fortified, and the more you expand, the more you spread yourself out, which means there is more play space. So you could attack an expansion on the left of the map, or you could attack an expansion on the right of the map. There's more opportunities for multitasking. There's more opportunities to actually hurt your opponent, to actually show weakness on either side. That goes for all three races. So expanding is, in my opinion, great, and it is one of the few things that can make StarCraft games dynamic instead of static, instead of turtley. This change is the opposite of that. Less mineral patches would be what I would push for. That would instead be a buff to Zerg, on the same vein that this is a nerf to Zerg because it promotes turtling. That would actually be a buff to Zerg in the way that Zerg is the best at expanding. But again, going back to design, going back to fantasy, going back to asymmetry, to me, that is the kind of buff that Zerg would actually want, from the perspective of, this is cool, this leans towards the identity, Zerg is like a virus, Zerg wants to spread, that's what you want to control, Zerg wants to expand, Zerg excels at that, etc., right? Zerg is mobility, Zerg is connection, all of these things. So from a fantasy design standpoint, I much prefer that, even though it is strictly a buff to Zerg compared to the other factions, that can be regulated on any other front. There are endless balance levers, so if that made Zerg too strong, you could always balance anywhere else, right? So again, to separate balance and design there, but yeah, to note also that this is a nerf to Zerg and a buff to turtle playstyles in particular. Okay, I hope that is clear. I'll read questions from the chat after. Zerg, hatchery, lair, and hive supplies reduced from 6 to 4. Creeps receipt rate slower. I'll say whatever on this. The hatchery and hive, it makes sense, right? It's consistent with the worker changes. So you start with your overlord, you have a certain amount of supply, and that's got to be reduced because you start with less workers. Makes sense. Spore crawler, damage against biological increased from 20 to plus 10 biological to 20 plus 15 biological. This is a balance change. Not the most interesting. It's basically like, okay, like mutas are too strong or something of the likes in the current meta. So that's just a straight up balance change. Nothing to woe about there. Carapace upgrades. Level 1 cost decreased from 150 to 100. Level 2 cost decreased from 200 to 150. Level 3 cost decreased from 250 to 200. So basically making Carapace the same as the other upgrades, like melee upgrades, for example, for Zerg. And yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I don't know that it's necessary. But I guess I don't hate it. I'd have to try it out. I like upgrades a little bit more expensive. I think upgrades are very, very strong in StarCraft, and they offer this very sharp timing. So this will kind of like, you know, like kind of mix things up a little bit. I do think that Carapace is a little bit more widely useful than attack across the race. So I don't love it. I think that it was warranted that Carapace was a little bit more expensive, and I like that upgrades are a little bit heftier cost personally, but not the most massive change. We'll try it out. Infestor. Microbial Shroud range increased from 9 to 12. Microbial Shroud can now be cast without requiring an upgrade from the Infestation Pit. Neural Parasite on Builder SCVs will expire upon on the structure completion, and it now has an auto attack weapon. So there's a lot of changes to the Infestor here. Microbial Shroud increased from range increased from 9 to 12, and no longer requiring an upgrade. In my mind, is a pretty big overcorrection. I think that that's unnecessary. The Infestor is my favorite unit. I believe that Microbial Shroud is an incredibly strong spell. I believe that it is not used because it is behind an upgrade, so I like removing it from the upgrades. Like, the issue effectively with Microbial Shroud is that it is a very it is the kind of upgrade that is difficult to account for, because upgrades take a time to research, they take a cost. Infestor already has fungal growth, which is pretty good and is more reactive, and it is generally useful whether you're attacking or defending. Microbial Shroud, for the most part, is good on attack, but less so on defense, because the army is actively moving. When you attack into a fortified position, for example, and you know that there's going to be stuff to kill even if the army retreats, then Microbial Shroud actually gains value, right? It's like a siege tool. Because if your target, if the thing you're trying to kill, or if there are targets or things that you can kill that cannot move or are slow to move, which fungal can do as well, you can actually guarantee value out of it. Whereas if you just drop it in the middle of the map when there's an army fight, then your opponent can just run out of the Microbial Shroud, and it is pretty trash, right? So there, it's a very specific use case that you want for Microbial Shroud, and it is difficult to account for that use case in advance. Get the upgrade, hope that you still retain the energy from the infestors, so you have to camp energy on infestors, hope that it is better than fungal in the instances that you would use it, hope that you didn't spend your energy on fungal. So there's a lot of ifs and buts to currently use Microbial Shroud. I don't think that the spell is weak. I don't think that it needs a range increase. I think it's very strong, and I think that making it non-upgradable is probably extremely powerful. I will also add that Microbial Shroud on the infestor and Blinding Cloud on the Viper are very, very similar. They're both poofy clouds. I said this in my last video as well. They're both fart clouds, effectively, that both serve to do similar purposes, right? You cast one on top of your army, you cast the other one on top of your opponent's army, but the effect is similar. It's, okay, if you're my opponent, you gotta get out of the gas cloud one way or the other, or not attack into the gas cloud if it's on my end of things, right? So there's a lot of overlap in terms of, okay, this is a disruptive ability that does no damage, but it is a disruptive ability to the landscape of the fight, and it requires movement, etc. So I dislike that we have both, and I further dislike that we have both Microbial Shroud, now very accessible, and fungal growth on the infestor, because you effectively have a 1-unit combo now that can do both fungal, which restricts movement, and cast Microbial Shroud, which takes advantage of the movement. That is a fine combo, don't get me right. That is awesome that exists in the game. I just feel that it would be better off if it came from 2 different units, so that the player actually has to plan around those different units. I just don't like generalists, catch-all, like, you know, this unit does everything type scenarios. And for a spellcaster, that is as close as you will get, with both abilities being unlocked by default on the infestor. So what I would do personally is move Microbial Shroud onto the Viper, and remove the other cloud, right? And then just make it so that the Viper has Microbial Shroud, the infestor has fungal, and now the 2 spellcasters can combo together if you are apt enough, if you want to do the combo. It is obviously harder to execute, but I think it is cooler in terms of decisions, to actually think to make 2 different units, to actually account for the costs of 2 different units, different techs, etc. Right? It is just more of a layered design, rather than just, I'll make this unit and I'll do everything I needed to do. So in general, I dislike this. I would do something like bring back, for example, the Infested Terrans, but to be fair, that has a fantasy counterweight where it's weird, without the context of Brood War in mind, that infestors would poop out men with guns, right? So that is kind of like the problem with Infested Terrans, but they could be reworked, or like they could put a different model, or, you know, really not that many people complained about the Infested Terran being a man with gun when it first appeared. So I would prefer that for granularity on the infestor, for 2 different utilities on the infestor, because the infestor still will continue to run into the issue of this unit has 2 very costly spells, and whenever you don't have energy to cast either of them, they're pretty fucking worthless, right? So that just feels bad. At least it has an attack weapon now, so it won't go and suicide after casting its abilities. So that is a quality of life change that StarCraft has been trending towards. I'm not opposed to that. And the other changes, Neural Parasite on builder SAVs, will only expire at structure completion. From the perspective of that's cool, it's cool. You know, it's like, okay, like there is very extremely niche cases where you're actually going to be able to Neural Parasite an SAV, and that is the only use case, and you will be able to construct a command center from start to finish, right? That is the only use case. What I dislike about this, right, ignoring that one situation is cool, is the fact that you're introducing a new rule that only applies to one unit. I always hate those in StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 is not Dota 2. There are different brands of games that can account for different like design philosophies in terms of how complicated the game is, how many hitting mechanics there are, etc. StarCraft 2 thrives on being a very clean game in terms of it being intuitive, of it not having hidden rules, etc. So I just hate that they make exceptions here in order to introduce hidden rule into the type of game that StarCraft is, because StarCraft is just a very clean game, right? So from that perspective, I dislike it. From the perspective of the one specific instance where someone will make a command center from start to finish, it's okay, it's cool. Like, you know, 1% of the time it'll be good, but it will be a hidden mechanic unless you want to account for it on a tooltip that will grow for no reason, just to account for one specific instance. So not a fan of it overall, but I understand people are going to be excited about the prospect of seeing that happen. So it's fine. I can give it a pass, even though I'm not a fan. Viper, Abduct now considers siege tanks as a valid target. This change was terrible last time around. I commented on it. I said that this shouldn't be the case. Similar reason to what we just discussed with the Infestor. You're introducing a new rule that only applies to one unit. That is fucking weird. It's not the type of game that StarCraft is. And now that has been fixed. It's been reverted. So that is actually good. Like, the question that arose before is like, okay, like, why can they not abduct siege tanks, but they can abduct lurkers? Why can they not abduct, why can they not abduct other siege units, like liberators, for example, or what have you? And it's just weird, right? So I'm glad they corrected that, but they also introduced a new isolated rule. So it's, whatever. Overlord, speed without pneumatized carapace decreased from 0.9 to 0.7, can now issue load nearby unit commands. So this is a quality of life change, it's fine. Speed without pneumatized carapace decreased from 0.9 to 0.7. Sort of, my friend actually pointed out to me and to a group of friends that this effectively amounts to it being slower than it was in Heart of the Swarm, where we had the 6 worker starts. So that's really bad if that is the case, and I trust that is the case when you do the math, accounting for Blizzard time and whatever have you. So yeah, I'm sure this will get corrected. It's a balance that directional. It's a balance change that directionally makes sense. You start with less workers, therefore your Overlord should arrive later to actually scout, to actually not have that ease of scout embedded in it, right? Because in you having a slower economical start, that means that you ramp up later to your tech, etc., and the Overlord gains value arriving earlier comparatively, right? So this makes sense directionally, but on the execution front, it'll probably need to get buffed to like 0.8 or something like that. So that's an oversight that will probably get corrected. Overseer, changelings automatically inherit the order queue of the casting Overseer. Okay, changelings deaths are contagious to nearby changelings. So this is a quality of life change. It basically says, okay, you spotted the changeling, you killed the nearby changelings. It is tedious to kill changelings otherwise. So I think this is good. This is cool. Changelings and Overseers were considered very, very strong at high level play because it is so difficult to deny all the scouting, and the tax is mostly on actions, right? And obviously, if it is a problem at high level, on the action budget to actually spot and kill all the changelings, it is an even greater problem for players that have less actions to spare and less attention to spare, for a lack of experience. So this is a good change. Mutalisk glaives now prioritize targets. Arc slop increased to 180. Mutalisk glaives now prioritize targets. I don't know what that means, so I'm just gonna skip it. Terran, Command Center. Supplies provided from 15 to 13. Makes sense. Ghost. Okay, this is a pretty big one, actually. I read this one before. I haven't read through all of the changes, so a lot of these are gut reactions, but I actually went through this one. So Ghost is a pretty huge set of changes. Supply increased from 2 to 3. Health reduced from 125 to 100. Attack changed from 10 plus 10 versus light to 20. Attack range increased from 6 to 7. Steady targeting. Damage increased from 130 plus 40 to psionic to 170. Energy cost increased from 50 to 75. No longer cancels upon taking damage. Okay. So there's a lot of changes here. There's a few that I really like. There's a few that I really dislike. So let's break that down. Supply increased from 2 to 3. So from a balance perspective, this is the perfect change in the sense that ghosts are not meant to be massable. Terran in the late game can feel pretty impossible to beat in the end game, I should say, because you have the ability to get enough orbital commands that you can mine without allotting supply cost to SCVs. Right, and without the SCV supply cost, when you suicide your SCVs in the end game, the Terran army effectively can become much larger than the Protoss or Zerg army. And obviously, if you have 200 supply of army versus 150 or 120 supply of army, you're gonna trade extremely effectively, and that's not gonna bode well for the other factions. So increasing the supply to the Ghost is actually good in that sense, because Ghost is one of the strongest units per supply for sure at 2, and increasing it to 3 makes it so that you know you fill up your supply a little bit more. So from that perspective of balance, A+, 100%. From the perspective of fantasy, of game design, etc., it's a 1 out of 10 for me. And the reason for that is the Ghost looks very small. The HP actually got nerfed, so it just doesn't make sense to me, visually speaking, that a Marine costs 1 supply and a Ghost costs 3 supply. It's just a gap that is difficult to parse from the perspective of the fantasy. So even though from the perspective of balance it's a viable change and a fine change, I don't like the dissonance that it creates on the fantasy front. So I would look for alternative changes that don't have that problem. Health reduced from 125 to 100. Again, with a supply increase, I think that's dissonant. From the perspective of balance, it's probably fine. Now, attack damage changed from 10 plus 10 to light for plus 10. Yeah, 10 plus 10 versus light to 20. Now, this is a change that I actually proposed in my previous video to some degree. I said remove the extra damage to light, right? I proposed remove the extra damage to light because the Ghost is too good, too well-rounded. I did not mean, however, add it as a total, because that's the fucking worst thing that you can do, right? Now the Ghost is a stronger generalist, so you have the problem of this unit that is super fucking strong for cost. Even at 3, it's gonna be decent per supply, and now you make it more of a generalist. So before it at least wasn't good against certain targets. Now it's pretty fucking decent against everything on auto attacks. And auto attacking is not, in my opinion, what should be the identity of a Ghost, which in my mind is more of a spellcaster than an army unit. It being an army unit is what makes it massable. Spellcasters usually have limited amounts of utility. Army units, you can usually mass up more. So again, instead of doing the supply change, you could have just reduced its damage to 10, or a middle ground, 12, maybe 15 if you want to be crazy. But 20 is pretty fucking insane. You don't want to make the Ghost a generalist. That is the worst possible direction for a unit that already counters pretty much everything in the game. And whenever a unit counters everything in the game, it's really bad, obviously, for diversity of army compositions, frustration, late game, etc. So attack range increased from 6 to 7. I also proposed this in the last change, in the last video that I made, right? I said the Ghost is a sniper. It makes sense if it has a longer range. It's a spellcaster. It's okay for it to stay further back, but not if you're fucking doubling its damage, right? Or at least retaining its damage against light and doubling it against everything else. Because now you have an army unit that sits further back, that already probably compensates for the nerf on the HP front. and it leans all the way more towards turtling, right? Now your unit is more fragile. Now you don't want it to get caught out on the map more. Now it's stronger behind buildings, it's stronger on high grounds, and it is good against everything. This is just a bad combination. I think if the attack range is increased to 7 and you have the damage at 10, that is perfectly fine, because if you're tickling from far away while not using your ghost in the way that it's intended, as a spellcaster, as a support unit, as a specialist, and instead it's a generalist that just can shred everything from a distance, it is just a fucking bad recipe. Now, steady targeting. Damage increased from 130 to plus 40 versus Psionic to 170. Energy cost is increased to 75. No longer cancels upon taking damage. Again, terrible set of changes. This is not something that makes any sense to me. Increasing the damage from 130 plus 40 to Psionic was basically a ceremonial change. If you look at the units that are Psionic that can actually get affected by steady targeting or snipe, the set is pretty narrow. It's actually like, just for the most part, just infestors, ghosts themselves, high templars, and maybe there's a couple more, but by large I think those are the big ones that are Psionic and suffer against the increased damage from snipe. So from the perspective of let's remove this because it's ceremonial, it's useless, those units already get countered by the other spell that the ghost has more effectively, which is EMP, because it's, you know, it's a little bit more you can use it faster, and it's intended to actually blow up energy, and all of those units have energy, so why do they have both is a fine change. It's like, okay, remove the extra 40 damage to Psionic. Why the hell are you adding the extra damage to Psionic on top of the normal ability, which is already incredibly strong? Sure, you change the energy cost to compensate, but I'm not sure why that's even a thing to do. Why are you compensating for a problem that you've introduced? And no longer cancels upon taking damage also makes the spell not only more stronger, but less difficult to interact with. You cannot cancel this spell by AoE damage, such as fungal or storm, or just attacking it with units, right? So the Terran player gets to be less careful. When you cast your snipe, it's probably going to go through. The other races have less counterplay. Less counterplay is always worse, right? Because it means less interactions. Less interactions leads to more frustration, less skill expression, etc., etc. So all of you know, as a bundle, I would give this a 3 out of 10 from a fantasy and flavor perspective. I really do like that they don't have extra damage to light, just because, you know, like, why should they be good against everything? But I hate that they added the damage on top. So it's, you know, this went backwards where it could have been a positive step forward. The range increased from a fantasy perspective, from a design standpoint. I think it's super cool. It's a sniper. It should have more range significantly than a marine. That makes sense. That looks cool. But, you know, in the total package is just a huge loss. It's just a massive buff and making a unit more of a generalist, which is already a unit that counters everything in the game. It counters everything in the game. Yeah, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I'm searching for words to say something different, but then I just say it counters everything in the game, because that's what it does. So fucking horrible. Medevac can now issue load nearby unit commands. Cool. That's a quality of life change. That's awesome. Subgroup priority updated from Raven, Ghost, Battlecruiser, Marine, Marauder, Siege Tank to Ghost plus Marine plus Marauder, Raven, Battlecruiser, Siege Tank. I saw that a few of my pro Terran player friends are happy about this. They think it's a good change, so I'll take their word for it. I don't really tinker with Terran enough to know that this is the right order, but I'll trust that it is a good quality of life change. Nexus. Supplies reduced from 15 to 13, sure. Warp Gate. This is the most interesting change of the batch. I'm very excited for it. I think it's probably going to need some balancing, but let's go for this one. So Warp Gate research moved to the gateway from the cybernetics core. Warp Gate research speeds up gateway unit production by 35%. Transform to Warp Gate cost increased from 0-0 to 50-50. Warp in time is no longer determined by slow power fields. Warp in time decreased to 3 seconds from 3.6 and 11.4. Warp gate cooldown values: Zealot from 20 to 22, Adept from 20 to 22, Stalker from 23 to 22, Sentry from 23 to 22, High Templar 32 to 35, and Dark Templar 32 to 35. So I guess they increased the High Templar and Dark Templar for whatever reason. Okay, so I think, like I said, for me, this is the most exciting change of the patch. I think it's a very daring change. I think it's the type of change that if I were a Protoss player, I'd be interested to tinker with from the perspective of design, of there's going to be new build orders, there's going to be new things to account for. It does pose a few different problems. Problem number one is going to be the ease of control of warp gates versus gateways, because you can anticipate that most players, or every player, will have stages of the game where they have some warp gates and some gateways, and you want to maintain production on both of them. So either you'll have to tab through or have them on different hotkey numbers, hotkey groups. So it becomes a little bit messier, a little bit more difficult for especially lower level players to actually maintain production. I believe that you can morph into warp gate or out of warp gate, but there is zero reason to morph back to gateways, right? So basically, once you transform it, your warp gate is just better. That was already a persistent problem, so we'll ignore that. Now, warp in time decreased to 3 seconds from 3.6 on powered pylons and 11.4 on bare pylons. To me, is no bueno. I think that having slow warp-ins or slower warp-ins is actually something interesting. It's a downside to the very strong mechanic that is warping in the first place. I think that it provides opportunities for counterplay. I think that it is a measure against proxies and such. So I don't like this in isolation. I think, however, the warp gate transform increased from 0-0 to 50-50 is very interesting, but it is probably pretty overpriced. That is a very, very steep cost to pay for a transformation. So you're hearing two different lines of thoughts here, because I think that this could be adjusted into something a little bit more cohesive that actually works. So 50 gas is a lot to pay. Maybe I would start with something like 50-25. For warp gate transformations, 50-50 is ridiculously steep. I think that this is likely in general to be pretty good for proxies, for early game all-ins and stuff like that without the slow power fields, but there is a good reason that slow power fields existed in the first place, that they require a further investment, etc. So I don't like that removed. Like I said before, I don't like limiting player interactions, counters, and so on and so forth. So I think what I would personally do with this is start at 50-25, because 50-50 is ridiculously strong. I think that I would retain slower warp-ins. I wouldn't remove the slow power fields. I would maybe reduce them if you really want to encourage more aggression and more cheese and more like foregating type strategies, right? So maybe you could decrease the warp-in time to 3 seconds. Maybe you could retain the slow warp-in and put it at 6 seconds or something instead of just outright removing it. This is mostly ceremonial. I mean, it's fine. I'm not sure why the High Templar and the Dark Templar are more expensive, but maybe there's a reason for that. I'm not really gonna give it too much thought. It's pretty small changes, and it's probably or an attempt to offset the upfront cost that you're paying for each gateway over time by requiring less warp gates to operate, right? So overall, my favorite change of the patch, in the sense that I think it has the most potential to actually mix up the game, mix up build orders, and make things more interesting. I am sad that Zerg and Terran didn't get something like this, so it is the one change in the patch that I'm like, wow, if I were a Protoss player, I'd have stuff to figure out, to think about, that is not just ceremonial. That's cool. But yeah, it's a nerf as it stands, I think. like too much of a nerf. It's probably like Protoss is probably pretty fucking shit with this in early game as it stands, but with some tweaks, I think it can get to a good place. Gateway. Pre-warp gate production time values. So this actually got increased. Oh, Zealot got increased. Adept got decreased. Stalker got increased. I guess they're trying to make all of them the same. That should help with management cycles to some degree. So I'm not opposed to that. It's a little bit odd, but it's okay. Yeah. Sentry from 23 to 24, whatever. Warp gate production time values. Post warp gate production time values. I'm a little bit confused as to what, or I see. Are these values this plus the warp-in time, or? I guess there's just a little bit of a gap in between. Okay. Post warp gate production time values: Zealot 18, Adept 18, Stalker 18, Sentry 16, High Templar 26, Dark Templar 2. Dark Templar 2? There's maybe a number missing there. Sentry. Hallucinations automatically inherit the current order queue of spellcasting of the casting Sentry. That's good. High Templars. Size Storm total damage reduced from 110 to 100. I think that's warranted. I think, yeah, Storm was too strong. I think that it was pretty oppressive. That should help a little bit. Disruptor now has a phantom attack weapon, so people won't suicide their disruptors anymore. It's a similar change to High Templar weapon, to Infestor weapon, and I like that this one is a ghost weapon because it doesn't really have anything anywhere to fire from that would look decent. So I like that it's an invisible weapon that probably doesn't do anything. It's just maintains distance. The one thing that I would be careful with, I haven't tested it personally, but if the weapon range is equal to the casting range, that might be a little bit troublesome. I would make sure that the weapon range is a little bit shorter than the casting range, because a lot of the time, ideally, you're not casting the disruptor shot at max range. Otherwise, it's too easy to dodge, right? So probably somewhere in between is where you want the phantom weapon range, between the, you know, between the disruptor itself and the max range, max casting range. But I'm not sure actually, but I hope they accounted for that. Warp Prism can now issue load nearby unit commands. That's cool. And then there's a bunch of quality of bugs, quality of life and bug fixes. I'll trust that those are all good things. Sometimes there's ninja balance or design changes in those, but I am not willing to go through them. So that's gonna be the breakdown on the patch and my unfiltered thoughts on approach. I had read about half of the patch beforehand and changes in particular on units that I was interested in seeing. And the rest is I got reaction from reading it now. So I hope you enjoyed, and yeah, see you next time.